Shalom, welcome back. Picking up in the study of Who is Esau Edom, Part 2. So for today's presentation, I'm going to be drawing pretty heavily from this book, Who is Esau Edom, by Charles Weisman. You can find a copy of this book for free online in a PDF form. It's $18 on Amazon. I know I've mentioned several times in earlier presentations that the way I got started studying biblical truth and kind of digging into the Bible and trying to learn more about God was about 12 years ago. I had prayed a prayer based upon James 1:5, where he says, anyone who lacks wisdom, ask and it'll be given to you. And if you could know how little I knew about the Bible back then, it would be kind of funny. Like, at the point that I said that, I'd read the Bible once or twice, all the way through, and I was pretty ignorant about it, honestly. And it was from that point forward that God began teaching me. And one of the forms that he would do is he would lead me to books or to videos or whatever type of information, but I could feel him drawing me toward a certain teaching. And this went on for years. Like God, really the Holy Spirit brought me up to the point that I am now. And one of the very first books that God brought me to was this book. And at the time, I couldn't really appreciate it. Like, I was just too green, I guess. I also didn't have a whole lot of confidence at that point that it was indeed God leading me to the information. I was thinking, maybe it's just my imagination, like I could definitely feel the something drawing me toward different places of study, different books or whatever. But it was some time before I really gained the confidence in it, and it's much later before I really got to where I felt like I could hear God's voice. A lot of his instruction was done by using a human instructor to give me information. And so with this book, I read this book because I didn't have a whole lot of knowledge about Judaism and the Jewish people and such. It really didn't take root too deep in me. And then I got involved in the Hebraic roots movement, which of course kind of almost deifies Judaism. People in the Hebraic roots movement just have this view of the Jews where they set them on a pedestal and such. And I ended up dismissing a lot of the information in this book. And then after my experience one-on-one with this group of people and things that just didn't feel right in relationships I would have with people in this group, like I just knew something wasn't right. Something just, it felt like there was a wall between me and them. When you would have a conversation with a Jew, and I couldn't figure out what it was. I couldn't put my hands on it. No matter how friendly you would be to them, this wall would remain. Like, you could only get to be so close to them. You'd be like an acquaintance, but you would never really be their friend. And recently, God brought me back to this book again. And this time when I read it, I was ready for it. And it opened my eyes to a lot of things. It connected a lot of dots for me. And so the point of all that is to say it's a really good book. You should check it out. It's a pretty short read. It's not very long. I think it's maybe 120 pages or so. It's short enough you could read it in one afternoon. It's fully referenced, so you can confirm anything that this author says. All he really does is connect dots. And so it's a really good book. Mr. Weissman has passed on, but he's got a number of books he put out on topics he researched. There's another book, The 13th Tribe by Kostler. You can find that free online. You might read that also. It talks a lot about the Khazars. But in this video, we're gonna talk primarily about this book. So anything on the screen that does not have a citation is going to be from this book. Anything from another source, I'm going to have cited. So, I like to provide citations on screen, but since I'm using this book so much, I'm not going to put it on every page. Just know if a slide is not cited, it's from this book. Otherwise, it will have a citation. Once again, why are we doing this? Isaiah 46 says that God declares the end from the beginning. I take it to be that he is declaring what's going to happen in the end times from Genesis, from the beginning. And he says that he's going to accomplish this. And there's things, one of the most peculiar things in the Bible to me is the way that all through the Old Testament, the Jews are the good guys. And then there's like this 300-year break between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And then, lo and behold, Yeshua appears on the scene. And who is the bad guys? Well, Judah's, the Jews are the bad guys. So how is it that Israel, including Judah, and then later on in the Old Testament they're called the Jews, the tribe of Judah is, how is it they go from being the good guy to the bad guy? And this understanding of who is Esau, Edom explains that. So we're picking up, this is in Mr. Weissman's book. It says, after the conquest of Judah by the Babylonians, some of the Edomites who had mixed with the Jews in their land resettled with them in Judea. 2 centuries later, all of Edom was driven out of Mount Seir. The Edomites were driven from Petra westward by the Nabateans in 312 BC, and before the middle of the 2nd century BC, they were occupying not only southern Judah, but also Hebron and the country to its north as far as Bethzur. The Nabateans now occupied Mount Seir, and the Edomites were driven into the old territory of Judah. The Maccabean family, a remnant of the true Judahites, had ruled Judea from 166 to 37 BC, and under Judas Maccabee, recaptured the city of Hebron from the Edomites in 164 BC. During the time of John Hyrcanus, 135 to 105 BC, the nephew of Judas, the Judahites were again faced with the hostility of the Edomians. Hyrcanus confronted the Edomites, causing a decisive change in the relations between the two factions. John Hyrcanus conquered the whole of Edom and took the forced conversion of his inhabitants to Judaism. Thenceforth, the Edomites became a section of the Jewish people. So, the Old Testament, of course, is coming from Hebrew and Aramaic sources. So the land of Edom is referred to as, Edomites, Mount Seir. Now, when the Greek language comes in as the source documents, the land that they're occupying is referred to as Idumea with an I. Same thing. It's just the way the language is transliterated is all that is. So Idumeans is Edomites essentially. So we know the story of Judas Maccabee. The whole story of Hanukkah where Judah Maccabee overthrew the Greeks and ran them out of Judea. Well, then he established this line of kings, and so his descendants became these Hashmonean kings. And John Hyrcanus, who ruled from 135 BC to 105 BC, was one of those kings. And what he did is he conquered Edom, and he forced the Edomites to convert to Judaism. And we have the reference from Josephus that speaks about that. It says, "But when Hyrcanus heard of the death of Antiochus, he presently made an expedition against the cities of Syria, and after this he took Samgada and the neighboring places, and besides these, Shechem, Gerizim, and the nation of the Kuthians. Hyrcanus took also Dora and Marissa, cities of Idumea, and subdued all the Idumeans, and permitted them to stay in that country, if they would circumcise their genitals and make use of the laws of the Jews. And they were so desirous of living in the country of their forefathers that they submitted to the use of circumcision and of the rest of the Jewish ways of living, at which time, therefore, this befell them, that they were hereafter none other than Jews." Now, I cannot overemphasize how important the words on your screen right now are. This is the key. When you understand the full picture, this will explain why the good guys in the Old Testament were now the bad guys in the New Testament. It was not because the Jews became bad. It was because they were supplanted, and it was a different group of people ruling Judea. And from this point on, the Edomites were considered Jews. And we're going to see that in several different sources. Thus, at this juncture of time, the Edomites were then incorporated with the Jewish nation, and their country was called by the Greeks and Romans Idumea. But the tide turned in favor of the Edomite faction when Julius Caesar made Antipater an Edomite, procurator of Judea in 47 BC. When Antipater was killed 4 years later, his son Herod gained power, but was rejected by the Judahites. Herod shrewdly gained the support of Rome. With a Roman army at his heels, he returned to Palestine, and after a 6-month siege, he captured Jerusalem and became king of Judea in 37 BC. Okay, so Antipater is the father of Herod the Great. Now, I'm not going to go into like a whole lot of detail with this, but if you were to pick up a copy of Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, and you can read the whole story. Antipater, he was also given Roman citizenship. Now, and this Roman citizenship conferred onto all of his descendants. So all of the children of Antipater were Roman citizens. That's where Paul had his Roman citizenship from, because Paul was a descendant of Herod, who of course was a descendant of Antipater. This is where the Edomites took control of Judea. And again, this piece of history here is not something that you're taught in church. The only way you know it is you get a little bit of the history by reading Maccabees, and then you get the rest of the history by reading Josephus. But most people don't read Josephus because it's written in kind of like this archaic King Jamesy English, and it's a big, thick, long book, and no one wants to read a big, thick, long book. But I'll tell you, Josephus has some of the most interesting information. If you'll just read, Antiquities and then the War of the Jews, you'll learn so much. And also, if you read these writings of Josephus and you see the way the Herods acted, it'll explain a lot with the way Paul acts, and it also explains a lot with the way that the modern day Edomites act. Like for instance, Herod yes, he rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, but he also built a lot of pagan temples. He built these pagan cities, like Caesarea was built by him. Of course, it's named after Caesar. So, he would claim to be a Jew, but he wasn't really a Jew. He was also a pagan. He was a pagan to the pagans. He was a Jew to the Jews. Kind of the same way as his great-grandson, Paul, who was also, to those under the law became as one under the law, to those not under the law as one not under the law, and so forth. This is a kind of a characteristic of the Herods and of the Edomites in general, even to this day. Herod was a shrewd and unscrupulous tyrant and was despised by the Judahites because he was an Edomian and not one of their own stock. Herod hated the people of Judah, and one of his first acts was to execute 45 of the leaders of the old aristocracy to eliminate any rivalry for leadership. Having secured the kingship, Herod next destroyed the priestly line of Hyrcanus, the last being Antigonus, who taunted Herod with his Edomian origin and asserted that the kingdom should fall on one of the royal family. Finally, he murdered Aristobulus, the last of the Aaronic high priest. Herod then sought to affiliate himself with the high priesthood through marrying Mariamne, Aristobulus' sister and the daughter of a high priest. So the marriage of Mariamne was just a ruse for Herod to be accepted as being Jewish, essentially. Interestingly enough, this also connects to Paul. In the Pinarian, Epiphanius says that the Edomites did not accept Paul, and they said that Paul was this pagan. The Ebionites. I think I said Edomites. The Ebionites would not accept Paul. And one of the things I said about Paul was that he was, this pagan that had come to Jerusalem, and he wanted to marry the daughter of the high priest, which is what his great-grandfather Herod did. So Paul got circumcised and converted to Judaism, but then he was still not allowed to marry that woman. And then he fell into a rage and began teaching against the law. And so, Paul's whole antinomian theology started because he was not allowed to marry this daughter of the high priest. Herod even rebuilt the temple, as it was in ruins from repeated sieges, part of which Herod was responsible for by his attack upon the city. The temple of God became, in a sense, Herod's temple. We thus find that in the years just before the time of Christ, Judea was controlled by an Edomite faction who usurped the Judahite name, land, and heritage. So in the book of Revelation, in the study that we did, when it talks about the second beast, the first beast is identified as Rome. The first beast is really easily identified as Rome. But the second beast that had the horns of a lamb but spoke like a dragon, that was this Edomite faction. The two horns were the two lines of authority that the Herodian Edomites had, which was the kingship of Judea and the high priesthood. So the Herods would appoint their friends and their donors as the high priest. And again, they wiped out the Aaronic high priest. So when you see the high priest in the New Testament, in the Gospels, those are not sons of Aaron. Those are pagans or Greeks or Idumeans. Under Hyrcanus, the Edomites were forced to be part of the Judean culture, but under Herod, the Herodian faction had control over the Judean culture and way of life. Confounding the matter is the fact that some of the Judahites had intermixed with Edomite, Canaanite, and other alien stock at the time they returned from the Babylonian captivity. These mixed-blood people were also hostile toward the Judean Israelites. With Antipater began this is from the Jewish Encyclopedia. It says, with Antipater began the Edomian dynasty that ruled over Judea till its conquest by the Romans. Immediately before the siege of Jerusalem, 20,000 Edomians under the leadership of John, Simon, Phineas, and Jacob appeared before Jerusalem to fight on behalf of the zealots who were besieged in the temple. And then there's the reference to Josephus. From this time, the Edomians ceased to be a separate people, though the name Idumea still existed at the time of Jerome. So, if you get online and you start looking into this connection with Edom and modern Jewry, you'll find that there's a quote that says Edom is in modern Jewry, and they'll say the Jewish Encyclopedia from 1929, volume 5, page 41. I could not confirm the quote is in the 1925 edition. I could not find an edition that I was 100% sure was the 1925 in a PDF form. I did find the 1905, went to volume 5, page 41, and it was an article about Idumea. However, the above statement on the reference page didn't say, that Edom is in modern Jewry, but it did have this quote, which is essentially saying the same thing. That from this time, the Edomians ceased to be a separate people from the Jews, right? And here it is, screenshot from the Jewish Encyclopedia. There's a lot of... the reason I'm showing these screenshots is because this subject is something that's kind of hotly debated, and people will get online and say, this reference doesn't say that. These people are making this up. Well, I'm showing you right here, screenshot that is exactly what it says. During Titus's siege of Jerusalem in 66 to 70 AD, 20,000 Edomians appeared before Jerusalem to fight in behalf of the zealots who were besieged in the temple. About 97,000 inhabitants of Judea were taken captive, and an unknown number had fled before or during the siege. So, and I believe I read this in the video series on Revelation, where this 20,000 Edomians showed up in outside the gate of Jerusalem. The zealots let them in, and the Edomians just began slaughtering all the Jews they can find, like any of the residents of Jerusalem. And they give this speech before they're let in, and the Edomians were saying, like, this is our city too. So, they were yelling up there at the Jews, why are you locking us out of our own city? So again, this falls back into how Edom and Judea essentially became one people. This is the last mention of the Edomites as a people in history, yet the biblical prophecy indicates that Edom would be an enemy of Israel in latter times. We find that their only connection to a present-day people and religion is with the Jews and Judaism. We thus need to trace back the origin of the Jews to see who they are and how they fit into the puzzle of who is Esau Edom. And the Jews of today fall within two main types, the Sephardic Jew and the Ashkenazi Jew. The Sephardim are also known as Spanish Jews and constitute about 5% of the Jews in the world. The Ashkenazim are the East European Jews, which are found in Poland, Russia, Germany, Western Asia. This group of Jews makes up about 90% of the so-called Jews in the world. Many reference and historical sources have unequivocally identified that the bulk of the Ashkenazi Jews were derived from a people known as Khazars, or Chazars in certain texts. The original Jewish Encyclopedia, 1905, revealed that the main stock of the Jews came from this Asiatic people known as Khazars. Here it is from the Jewish Encyclopedia, under the article Khazars, a people of Turkish origin whose life and history are interwoven with the very beginnings of the history of the Jews of Russia. Historical evidence points to the region of the Urals as the home of the Khazars. So, the Jews themselves admit that that's where they're descended from. The large majority of surviving Jews in the world is of Eastern European and thus perhaps mainly of Khazar origin. And this is from author Kessler. He wrote the 13th Tribe. And you can find the 13th Tribe online. Again, it's not a very long read either. And he gives you the entire history of the Khazars. And again, here it is, screenshot from the Jewish Encyclopedia, the part that I just read. The best historical evidence therefore shows that the Jews are not descended directly from the Israelites of the Bible, but derive much of their ancestry from the Khazars and other people of Turkish Asiatic blood. The Khazars are also of an Edomite stock, and both stocks make up the present Jews, as the historian H.G. Wells states. The Edomians were made Jews, and a Turkish people were mainly Jews in south of Russia. The main part of Jewry never was in Judea, and had never come out of Judea. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, the original stock of the Khazars came from the land of Edom. And then here's a quote from the Jewish Encyclopedia. Hasdai ibn Saprut, who was foreign minister to Abd al-Rahman, Sultan of Cordova, in his letter to King Joseph of the Khazars, and he wrote this letter around 960, speaks of the tradition according to which the Khazars once dwelt near the Seir Mountains. So again, you see this connection to Esau, Edom. And once again, the part in the red circle is from the Jewish Encyclopedia, and it's what I just read to you. So I'm not making it up. That's what they say. So the Seir Mountains are none other than the original land of Esau, Edom. And it says, thus dwelled Esau in Mount Seir. Esau is Edom, Genesis 36:8. Seir was a mountain range south of the Dead Sea and also known as the land of Edom. The Seir Mountains were the home of the Edomites for nearly a millennium. Thus, it should be no surprise that migrants from that land would recall the name of their original homeland. If the Khazars did originally dwell near the Seir Mountains, then the Khazars, and thus world Jewry, are racially of Edomite stock. And although they are called Jews, a term which is derived from the word Judah, these people are not true Judites, but became a mixture of a hybridized people consisting of Edomites, Hittites, Canaanites, Judites, Babylonians, Ishmaelites, Huns, Khazars, etc. When they migrated to other lands, throughout the centuries, they retained their Jew or Judite identity, but brought with them the religion of Babylon. And then here's a picture of a modern Jew next to what we know from drawings from the Middle East, what an ancient Hittite and what a Canaanite head looked like. And you can see the similar features there. There's an article in Veterans Today titled The Hidden History of the Incredible Evil Khazarian Mafia by Preston James. Now, this article, it didn't list any references, and so I don't really, I hate reading articles like that where people make these statements and you have no way to verify where they're getting their information from, but I am going to use just this one paragraph from the article. And it's given the history of this, the Khazars, and from 100 to 800 AD, this is before they had converted to Judaism. Notice the years. You know, the temple in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem itself was destroyed in 70. 30 years later, here in Khazaria, which is modern-day Ukraine, there is... suddenly this people group shows up. The timeline is awful convenient for the remnants of the Edomite Jews to have migrated up between the Caspian and Black Sea and into Ukraine, or what is modern-day Ukraine. So the Khazarians developed into a nation ruled by an evil king who had an ancient Babylonian black arts and occult oligarchs serving in his court. during this time, Khazarians became known to surrounding countries as thieves, murderers, and road bandits, and for assuming the identities of those travelers they murdered as a normal occupational practice and way of life. So, this was interesting to me for a couple of reasons, because this practice they have of assuming the identity of the travelers they murdered, it's kind of like this measure for measure principle of the Bible, where whatever you do, somebody's going to do to you. And Jacob secured the blessing that went with the birthright in the book of Genesis by assuming the identity of Esau. And now Esau has, measure for measure, assumed the identity of Jacob in the world. And this is a practice they've been doing for a while. I listened to an interview by one of the co-authors of this article, and he said that what they would do is that if a rich merchant traveled through Khazaria, they would murder him, and then one of the Khazarians would continue on the journey that this merchant was engaged in, and essentially do business under the name of this person they had murdered as a way to steal the rest of their wealth. And that's really what the Edomites are doing to this very day. The other thing that I found interesting about this was that the Babylonian connection, because that's something that you're going to run across a lot studying these Edomites. And that reminded me of something I had mentioned in the first video, this connection between Esau and Nimrod. Terah, Abram's father, served in the court of Nimrod. And, that's why Yahweh told Abram to get up out of your country and go to the land which I tell you. He was taking him away from these Nimrodian type of environment. So in the book of Jasher, which I don't normally reference stuff like the book of Jasher. To me, Jasher is kind of a questionable book, but when we're studying this whole issue of Esau, in my mind, it's not like you're trying to establish some kind of doctrine about Yahweh or, some type of religious, doctrine. You're looking at history. What is it that people think of Esau? Kind of what is the conception of Esau? So, a lot of times when you start thinking about things biblical, people can get kind of wrapped around the axle on things. But with the subject of Esau, for me, it's just a matter of, okay, what is it that the Jews were saying about Esau? What is, in their mind, what type of person is Esau? Rather than, it happened to be something coming straight out of the canon of Scripture, right? So, for that reason, I'm going to use Jasher, and I do think this is interesting. It says, and the king, Nimrod, was grieved at the sight because he had this dream, and he awoke out of his sleep, and his spirit was agitated, and he felt a great terror. And in the morning the king rose from his couch in fear, and he ordered all the wise men and magicians to come before him. And when the king related his dream to them, and a wise servant of the king, whose name was Anuki, answered the king, saying, "This is nothing else but the evil of Abram and his seed, which will spring up against my master and king in the latter days." So Nimrod had a bad dream, and his wise men saying it's because of Abram, that the seed of Abram was going to rise up against Nimrod. And in fact, one of Abram's seed did. It was a wicked seed, and it sprang up in Nimrod's latter days and killed him, and that was Esau. So Yashar chapter 27, verse 4, and on a certain day Esau went in the field to hunt, and he found Nimrod walking in the wilderness with his 2 men. And all his mighty men and his people were with him in the wilderness, but they were moved at a distance from him, and they went from him in a different directions to hunt. And Esau concealed himself from Nimrod, and he lurked from him in the wilderness, and Nimrod and his men that were with him did not know. And Nimrod and his men frequently walked about in the field at the cool of the day, and to know where his men were hunting in the field. And Nimrod and 2 of his men that were with him came to the place where they were, when Esau started suddenly from his lurking place and drew his sword and hastened and ran to Nimrod and cut off his head. And Esau fought a desperate fight with the 2 men that were with Nimrod, and when they called out to him, Esau turned to them and smote them to death with his sword. So, another thing I should probably mention is this story is actually also recorded in the Jewish Encyclopedia. It actually makes reference to Esau killing Nimrod. So, also, according to the book of Jasher, Nimrod had garments that Yahweh had made for Edom and Hava. So, at the end of the book of Genesis, where he made clothes for Adam and Eve, it says in Jasher that they had handed down these clothes to Noah, down through the generations, and then Ham had stolen them. And these garments were coveted by Esau. And so it says, and the garments of skin which God had made for Adam and his woman when they went out of the garden were given to Cush. For after the death of Adam and his woman, the garments were given to Enoch, the son of Jared, and when Enoch was taken up to God, he gave them to Methuselah, his son. And at the death of Methuselah, Noah took them and brought them into the ark, and they were with him until he went out of the ark. And in their going out, Ham stole these garments from Noah his father, and he took them and hid them from his brothers. And when Ham begot his firstborn Cush, he gave him the garments in secret, and they were with Cush many days. And Cush also concealed them from his sons and brothers. And when Cush had begotten Nimrod, he gave them those garments through his love for him. And Nimrod grew up, and when he was 20 years old, he put on the garments. And Nimrod became strong when he put on the garments. So, I'm going to pause here for a minute and just mention what is said about Nimrod in the Clementine literature. In the recognitions of Clement, at one point, Peter's talking about the history of the earth, the biblical history, and when he gets to the part about Nimrod and his family, he says Nimrod was the first one that taught men to worship idols after the flood, and that Ham had begun practicing the magical arts, and when he died, he was they changed his name. He became known as Zoroaster, and then he passed on these magical arts to Cush, and Cush passed on these magical arts to Nimrod, and that they were all in succession. Their title was Zoroaster. And so when you take someone's garments, symbolically it has to do with taking their authority. And so these garments, according to the text here, the garments themselves were meant to be passed on through the righteous men of the earth. And so naturally Noah would have probably given them to Shem, and then Shem to Eber, and Eber to Abraham, and passed on to Isaac and Jacob. But also when Nimrod was killed by Esau, and Esau took his garments, and again, this is my understanding or something that I'm thinking. This is not something that's in the text. in my mind, in addition to taking the garments, it's almost like he's taken that authority. He's taken that Zoroaster, sorcerer authority upon himself, because you're going to see as we get deeper in this study, there's a lot of connections with the Edomites and occultic practices to this day. And when the Jews were taken into Babylonian captivity, Edomites were taken with them. The prophet Jeremiah talks about that. So after the destruction of the temple, a lot of these Edomites went back to Babylon, and that's where the Babylonian Talmud comes from. But they essentially recreated the religion of Judaism as a anti-Yeshua type of religion. And so, you talk about the Antichrist. I mean, it's literally the Antichrist religion, first of all, and it's Babylonian. And so this whole, Kabbalah, mysticism, and all that stuff, it all relates back to, in my opinion, it relates back to this. This is when Esau inherited that from Nimrod by killing him and taking his garments. So moving on, it says, and when Esau saw the mighty men of Nimrod coming at a distance, he fled and thereby escaped. And Esau took the valuable garments of Nimrod, which Nimrod's father had bequeathed to Nimrod, and with which Nimrod prevailed over the whole land, and he ran and concealed them in his house. So first he took them to his house, and then he took the garments and ran into the city on account of Nimrod's men, and he came into his father's house. So now he's brought him into Isaac's house. Wearied and exhausted from fight, and he was ready to die through grief when he approached his brother Jacob and sat before him. And thus he said to his brother, Behold, I shall die this day, and wherefore do I want the birthright? And Jacob acted wisely with Esau in this matter, and Esau sold his birthright to Jacob, for it was so brought about by Yahweh. And Esau's portion in the cave of the field of Machpelah, where Abraham had bought from the sons of Heth for the possession of a burial ground, Esau also sold to Jacob, and Jacob bought all this from his brother Esau for value given. And of course, I think it's funny the way they word that, value given. The value given was the pot of lentils. So this would explain why Esau was so exhausted when he ran into Jacob that day and wanted that red lentils. And like I said, Jewish Encyclopedia also tells this whole story. It actually says that Esau, from this point forward, he didn't trust his wives, so he would never leave Nimrod's garments at his own house. He left them at Isaac's house. And anytime he would come visit Isaac, Esau would put on these Nimrod garments and wear them in front of Isaac and around Isaac's house. And again, here's a passage from Genesis. Sell me your birthright now. I'm about to die. What use is the birthright to me? And of course, in this exchange, when Jacob was taking on the identity of Esau to get the blessing from his father, Rebekah says took the best garments of Esau, her older son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. So, according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, these were actually Nimrod's garments that she put on Jacob. And in a sense, the garments themselves were part of the birthright because they were intended to be passed down to Jacob anyway. So anyway, I found that interesting. That's really the only reason I told the whole story is because I was interested in it. But I also did want to make this connection between Nimrod, the founder of Babylon, and Esau, the person carrying on the traditions of Babylon to this day. Again, Esau and Nimrod are the only people in the book of Genesis referred to as hunters. So there's a connection there, and then there's also this other connection which you could you could file it away as just a traditional type of thing, but in the mind of the Jewish people and the Jewish encyclopedia, they connect Esau with Nimrod, and they also connect Esau with Rome. But at the same time, in the same book, they admit that Esau is actually part of the modern Judaism. So, anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for listening, and we'll pick it up in the next video. We're going to look at some of the things that Yeshua has to say about the Edomites in Judea. Maybe look at some of these gospel passages from a new point of view, from the point of view that he's actually speaking to descendants of Esau, not descendants of Jacob. So thank you for listening. I pray that this has been a blessing, and shalom.